When people ask me whether they should build wealth through stocks or through real estate, I do not usually answer immediately. I ask a more important question first. Why are you asking now? That question matters more than most people think. Very often, the real reason is not that the person has done a calm, logical comparison of liquidity, risk, taxes, cash flow, leverage, and sequence. The real reason is that somebody close to them has started making money in one of those areas. A friend bought a rental property and now talks about cash flow. A coworker bought a stock that went up and now talks as if he discovered a secret. A relative says real estate is how the wealthy get rich. Another person says the stock market is the easiest way to build wealth. Suddenly, the idea is everywhere. But the idea was not suddenly created. It was always there. Your mind simply started paying attention to it. There is a name for this. It is often called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, or frequency illusion. When something becomes relevant to you, you begin noticing it everywhere. If you are thinking about buying a certain kind of truck, suddenly you see that truck on every road. It is not because the world changed overnight. It is because your attention changed. The same thing happens with investing. When people start hearing about real estate profits, real estate appears everywhere. When people start hearing about stocks, the market appears everywhere. This can be useful, but it can also be dangerous. It is useful because attention creates learning. It is dangerous because attention can also create impulse. One of the principles I have learned over my life is that the order in which you do things matters. The right asset in the wrong sequence can hurt you. The wrong level of risk at the wrong point in your life can set you back. A good tool used before you understand how it works can become a bad tool. That is why, when I am speaking to someone who is just beginning, I usually, not because stocks are always better than real estate, not because real estate is bad. Real estate can be one of the most powerful wealth-building tools there is. It has tax advantages, it can create cash flow, it can use leverage, it can appreciate, it can be passed through generations in intelligent ways. But the question is not where you eventually want to end. The question is where you should begin. When you buy shares in a company, something important happens inside your mind. The company becomes relevant. If you buy Coca-Cola, you begin noticing Coca-Cola. You see its products, you hear its earnings, you look at its dividend, you start asking what a price-to-earnings ratio means. You wonder why the stock moved. You begin to connect small pieces of information that were invisible before. That is how learning begins. You can watch videos for months and still not care. You can read articles and not remember them. But when you own something, even a small amount, the feedback loop changes. You have skin in the game, the information now matters. This is one of the most important ways competence is built. Not by pretending to be an expert, not by consuming endless opinions, not by copying what a stranger says. Competence comes from owning something small enough that it cannot destroy you. Then watching it closely, learning how it behaves, and adjusting your understanding as reality teaches you. In my experience, you do not need to be an expert to begin. You need to become competent. Expertise can take many years. Competence can come much faster when you focus, observe, and have a little real exposure. That is why stocks can be a good starting point. They allow you to make smaller mistakes. They are liquid, they can be studied in real time, they can be bought in small amounts. They teach you how businesses work. They teach you how emotions work. They teach you how markets behave when people are afraid, greedy, confident, confused, and wrong. That is valuable. If you buy a stock and make a mistake, the stock may go down. You may lose part of what you invested. That is not pleasant. But if you size the position properly, it should not ruin you. If you buy a rental property and make a mistake, the downside can be much more complicated. A tenant can stop paying, a roof can fail. An air conditioning system can break. A property tax bill can rise. Insurance can change. A tenant can damage the unit. A legal problem can appear. You may still have to pay the mortgage while the property is not producing income. That is not just a price movement on a screen, that is an operating problem. And operating problems require capital, time, judgment, and emotional control. This is why I tell people to be careful about sequence. Real estate can be excellent once you can absorb its problems. It can be dangerous when one problem can wipe out your cushion. When a person is just starting, the first job is not to maximize upside. The first job is to avoid getting knocked out of the game. If you stay in the game long enough, you can learn. If you get knocked out early, the lesson may be too expensive. The way I think about wealth building is not as a single bet. I think of it as a system of buckets. Each bucket has a role. Each one protects against the weaknesses of the others. A useful long-term structure is to think in terms of roughly 30% in income-producing stocks, 30% in real estate or real estate-related assets, 30% in managed money or investments where you are not making every decision yourself, and 10% in cash or cash equivalents. The exact numbers can vary by person. The principle matters more than the precision. You do not want everything depending on one thing. You do not want every outcome tied to one property, one stock, one city, one employer, one cycle, one decision, or one belief. That is how people become fragile. A good system gives you multiple ways to survive and multiple ways to win. The stock bucket teaches you to understand businesses and cash flow. It can include dividend-paying companies. It can include companies that produce income and have long records of distributing profits. It can also include strategies where you are paid in more than one way, such as receiving dividends, buying at attractive prices, or selling the right for someone else to buy your shares at a higher price if you understand how that works. The real estate bucket gives you exposure to property, rents, tax advantages, and hard assets. The managed money bucket helps reduce the danger of believing you must make every decision yourself. Sometimes this can be an ETF. Sometimes it can be a managed account. Sometimes it can be a syndication or another structure where the key is that you are not relying only on your own day-to-day decisions. The cash bucket gives you optionality. It is dry powder. It protects you when something breaks. It lets you act when others are forced to sell. It helps you avoid panic. Panic destroys wealth. Cash is not always a great long-term asset because it may lose purchasing power over time. But as a strategic reserve, it is powerful because it gives you control when other people lose control. When you are beginning, though, I would not try to build all buckets at the same speed. I would first build competence. And for many people, the easiest place to build competence is the stock market. The first reason is liquidity. If you buy a stock today and need the money later, you can usually sell it quickly. It may be at a gain or a loss, but you can get liquidity. If you buy a property and need money quickly, that is a much harder problem. Selling a property can take months. Borrowing against it may not be available when you need it. If the market is weak, the property may not sell at the price you imagined. If there are tenant issues, maintenance issues, title issues, or financing issues, liquidity can disappear. For a beginner, liquidity is not a luxury, it is protection. It gives you margin for error. And when you are new, you need margin for error because you will make mistakes. Everybody does. The second reason is the learning curve. People often think real estate is easier because they can see it and touch it. A house feels more understandable than a financial statement. A building feels more real than a stock. But understanding what a house is and understanding real estate investing are not the same thing. Real estate investing done well requires understanding markets, financing, reserves, capital expenditures, tenants, maintenance, property management, insurance, vacancy, legal structures, cash flow, taxes, and risk control. Those are real variables. If you get one wrong, the cost can be high. Stocks also require learning, but you can begin with much smaller amounts and with less operational complexity. That is why I prefer quality first. Do not start by gambling. Do not start by buying something because a friend said it was going to explode. Do not start with a tiny speculative company you do not understand. Begin with boring. Boring is often where discipline is born. Look at companies that have paid dividends consistently. Look at businesses with long histories. Look at companies that have survived multiple cycles. Look at companies that have raised their dividends over many years. The point is not that these companies can never go down. They can. The point is that they give you something to study that is rooted in cash flow, durability, and history. A dividend is simply a way a company shares profits with owners. If you own part of a private pizza shop and the business made more money than it needed to keep operating, the owner could distribute some of that money to you. Public companies can do the same thing. If you own shares, you own a small claim on the business. If the board decides to distribute cash, you receive a dividend. Some companies have raised those dividends for decades. That tells you something about the nature of the business. It does not guarantee the future, but it gives you evidence of durability. Evidence matters in investing. I try to avoid opinions without evidence. I want to know whether the company has a consistent record. I want to know whether the dividend yield makes sense. I want to know whether the dividend has been growing. I want to know whether the business is stable. I want to know whether revenue is durable. I want to know whether the valuation is reasonable. I want to know whether there is analyst support, not because analysts are always right, but because I want to see how the market is thinking about it. The point is not to become dependent on outside opinions. The point is to build a checklist. A checklist helps reduce emotion. It forces you to slow down. It makes you ask the same questions repeatedly. That repetition builds pattern recognition. At first, terms like price-to-earnings ratio, dividend yield, revenue stability, covered calls, or analyst ratings may feel abstract. But when you own even a small position, those terms become more real. They stop being textbook ideas and become part of how you understand what you own. That is the learning benefit. The market becomes a classroom. Your small position becomes tuition. If you structure it carefully, the tuition does not have to be ruinous. This is how I would want to be. How do I get rich as fast as possible? Ask, how do I become the kind of person who understands how wealth is built? That question changes everything. If you become that person, the money can follow. If you chase the money before becoming that person, the market will often take the money back. Now let me be clear about real estate. I am not against it. I like real estate. I believe it can be one of the great tools for building and preserving wealth. The tax code is often favorable to real estate. Depreciation can shelter income. Bonus depreciation can matter when available. Leverage can increase returns if used properly. Control can be powerful. There are also tools such as exchanges and step-up in basis that can make real estate very efficient if planned well. But good tools are not safe just because they are good. A chainsaw is useful. It can also cut your leg off if you do not know how to use it. Real estate is like that. Many people see someone else making money in real estate and assume the process is simple. They see rent coming in and forget the expenses. They see appreciation and forget the debt. They see leverage and forget that leverage works both ways. They hear about tax benefits and forget that cash flow still has to work. That is where beginners get hurt. Somebody saves $20,000 or $30,000, they watch a few videos, they find a cheap rental in a market they do not understand. They buy it because the numbers looked good on a spreadsheet. Then the tenant stops paying, the air conditioning fails, the roof leaks, property taxes rise, insurance costs increase, the property manager is not good. Suddenly, what looked like passive income becomes active stress. If that $20,000 or $30,000 was their entire cushion, the property does not just become a bad investment, it becomes a threat to their financial stability. That is what I want people to avoid. The question is not whether real estate works. The question is whether you are prepared for the problems that come with it. If you own enough properties, the problems can average out. One roof is not fatal if you have reserves. One bad tenant is not fatal if you have cash flow and diversification. One vacancy is not fatal if you plan for it. But if you own one property and no reserves, one bad event can feel like the end of the world. That is why, when people are determined to get real estate exposure early, I prefer lower risk paths. One path is house hacking. You buy a place where you live in part of it and rent out part of it. It could be a house with extra rooms. It could be a duplex. It could be a triplex. It could be a small multifamily property. You occupy one part and let the other parts help pay the mortgage. This can be a useful bridge because you are learning the landlord business with training wheels. You are not buying a property across the country in a market you do not understand. You are living in the asset. You see the problems. You learn what tenants care about. You learn what maintenance means. You learn how expenses behave. You have skin in the game, but you are not jumping straight into the deepest water. Another path is the live in improvement strategy. You buy a primary residence that needs work. You live in it, you improve it, you understand the rules around living in the property for at least 2 of the last 5 years before selling. If done properly, a single person may be able to exclude a significant amount of gain from federal taxes, and a married couple may be able to exclude more. The details matter, and you need proper advice. But the principle is straightforward. You are using a place you already need, your home, as a way to build equity. You are not renting it to others. You are not taking on the full operating risk of a traditional rental. You are improving an asset while living in it. For some people, that can be a smart starting point. Another path is real estate investment trusts. A REIT allows you to own exposure to real estate through a publicly traded vehicle. It behaves more like a stock in terms of liquidity, but it gives you exposure to property types, rents, and real estate cycles. You can study how the company owns assets, manages debt, collects rent, and pays distributions. REITs do not give you every benefit of direct property ownership. They do not give you the same control. They can move with the stock market. They have their own risks. But for learning, they can be excellent. They let you study real estate without trapping all of your capital inside one property. Again, sequence matters. You can learn before you take on the full load. One of the biggest problems in investing today is that people read simplified explanations from people who are not actually experts. This happens in almost every field. When I read something in an area I know, well, I can see the oversimplifications immediately. But when I read about an area I do not know well, I may not notice the errors. That is a cognitive trap. It is sometimes called the gel-man amnesia effect. You see a media report in your field and know it is wrong, then you turn the page and believe the next report in a different field. The same happens with investing content. A real estate strategy can look simple when described by someone who is not carrying the risk. A tax strategy can look simple when explained by someone who has never defended it. A stock strategy can look easy when someone only shows the winners. Artificial intelligence can give confident answers and still be wrong. Forums can make complicated decisions sound obvious. That is why you need systems, not just stories. If someone says a rental property produces $1,500 a month, you should not assume that $1,500 is profit. It is revenue. A lot can disappear before you get to keep anything. There are taxes, there is insurance, there is maintenance, there are management fees, there is vacancy, there are repairs, there are capital expenditures, there are legal and administrative costs. There are surprises. A conservative underwriter does not pretend that all rent belongs to the owner. If a property rents for $1,500 a month, I would start by assuming a large portion of that disappears into operating costs and reserves, maybe roughly half depending on the property and market. Then I would ask whether the remaining amount covers the debt service and still leaves positive cash flow. If the math does not work, I do not do the deal. This sounds simple, but most mistakes happen because people do not respect simple rules. They fall in love with the asset. They believe rent will always arrive. They underestimate repairs. They ignore vacancy. They assume appreciation will rescue them. They forget that debt is real. They let the story override the math. That is not investing. That is hoping. A principle I have learned again and again is that you should not rely on being right about everything. Build a system that can survive being wrong about some things. This is why I like the bucket model. If you have only stocks and the market falls, your emotions can control you. If you have only real estate and one property fails, your cash flow can break. If you have only cash, inflation can quietly reduce your purchasing power. If you only follow someone else, you may not know what you own. But if you build multiple buckets over time, you become more balanced. You can use one strength to offset another weakness. Stocks give liquidity and learning. Real estate gives hard asset exposure and tax potential. Managed money gives decision diversification. Cash gives optionality and resilience. The system does not have to be perfect. It has to be durable. Now, if I were explaining the sequence to someone starting from the beginning, I would say this. Begin with stocks, but not as a gambler. Begin with quality. Begin with companies that force you to learn. Begin with dividends if income and discipline help you understand the machine. Study how the business makes money. Study whether it returns money to owners. Study whether it has a history of surviving different environments. Study valuation. Study risk. Build your pattern recognition. Do not go too fast. Do not believe you are competent because you made money in a rising market. Many people confuse a bull market with intelligence. A rising tide can make a poor decision look wise for a while. The real test comes when conditions change, Once you have some competence, some liquidity, and some capital, begin learning real estate in ways that do not threaten your survival. House hack if it fits your life. Improve a home you live in if you understand the rules and can do the work. Use REITs if you want real estate exposure without operational complexity. Study how real estate cash flow really works. Then, as your capital grows, begin moving toward a balanced allocation. Not because 30-30-30-10 is magical, because the principle behind it is sound. You want exposure to different wealth machines. You want income-producing assets, you want real assets, you want professional or diversified management, you want cash, you want to avoid overconfidence, you want to avoid fragility. That is how you build wealth that lasts. Most people do the opposite. They see what is hot and jump. They copy someone else's chapter 20 while they are still on chapter 1. They put all their capital into a move they do not understand. They take risk before they have resilience. Then when reality teaches them, the lesson is too expensive. I have seen people blow themselves up with strategies they did not understand. I have seen people use complex options without knowing the downside. I have seen people buy properties without enough reserves. I have seen people chase markets after the easy money was already made. They were not bad people. They were not unintelligent. They were simply out of sequence. They tried to run before they could balance. The goal is not to look sophisticated. The goal is to compound. Compounding works best when you do not interrupt it with avoidable disasters. That is the reason liquidity matters. That is the reason education matters. That is the reason reserves matter. That is the reason sequence matters. If you begin with stocks, you can learn how money behaves. You can study businesses. You can understand cycles. You can see fear and greed in real time. You can build confidence without putting your entire financial life at risk. If you move into real estate, do it thoughtfully. Respect the operating risks. Respect tenants. Respect maintenance. Respect debt. Respect the fact that a property can demand money from you at the worst possible time. Use conservative math. Do not count gross rent as profit. Do not buy because someone online made it sound easy. If you build a diversified system, you become harder to knock down. That is the real goal. Not maximum excitement, not maximum bragging rights, not being able to tell people you own rentals, not being able to say you beat the market for a quarter. The goal is to become the kind of investor who can stay calm, understand the machine, and keep playing through different environments. The truth is that both stocks and real estate can build wealth. The better question is which one should teach you first and which one should you take on when you are ready for its risks. For most beginners, I would start with stocks because stocks are liquid, scalable, educational, and less operationally dangerous when sized properly. Then I would add real estate when I had enough capital, reserves, and understanding to handle the problems that always come with it. Then I would build across the bucket so that no one decision can destroy me. That is how I think about it. Start with the thing that teaches you without destroying you. Move into the thing that can magnify wealth once you understand it. Keep cash so you are never forced to sell at the wrong time. Do not confuse activity with progress. Do not confuse leverage with wisdom. Do not confuse a story with a system. The biggest advantage you can build is not a secret investment. It is the ability to make decisions in the right order. That is what keeps you alive long enough for compounding to work. And once compounding is working, time becomes your partner. That is the game.